Crime is everywhere and constantly on the rise. Quick and easy cases are solved daily, but what about those more sinister and cold cases that remain to be solved? Join Ashley Moreno as she dives into the horror of some of these cases and sheds some light on what is truly behind the realm of darkness. Here is your host, Ashley Moreno.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Realm of Darkness. I'm excited to be back after 2 weeks because unfortunately last week the show got canceled due to storms and tornado warnings and all kinds of crazy things. But because of that, Kayla is so nice to join as our special guest host tonight. She's going to help me try to keep things streamlined and keep me on track because everyone knows I'm a hot mess and likes to jump around.
You chose me?
Well, I figured we can be hot messes together. But tonight, we are going to be talking about some of my favorite topics. One of them being Jeffery Dahmer, one being mental health awareness and taking care of yourself. And then also kind of like, does environment affect how you turn out as an adult? So it's kind of a mixture of all of those, and I'm super excited about it. So tonight, I'm just going to bring her in because I'm really excited. Our guest tonight is Dr. Adrianne Robertson. So everyone, please say hello. There she is. Hi, how are you?
Hi, I'm good. Happy to be here.
Oh, I'm so excited to have you and to kind of like dive into this because I believe that mental health is such a huge thing that people need to take care of themselves. But with that, why don't you just kind of tell everybody a little bit about yourself and a little bit about your background?
Yeah, absolutely. So, of course, I came in the other room and my dog followed me and is whining. So I apologize for his whining right now. But yeah, I am Dr. Adrianne Robertson. I am a counselor educator that I'll be starting at Rowan University. So basically, I'm going to be a college professor teaching master's students how to be counselors. And I've been in the mental health field for over a decade, working in residential, inpatient, and then I actually have my own private practice, ACR Counseling and Consulting. And then I've also been a school counselor. I'm really big on mental health in kids, and this is right up my alley because I oftentimes, and I've done research on mental health and how it impacts academics. And so, in light of what's going on in the world right now, I think this is a great topic. And yeah, just really excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm super excited because I know, you're friends with my husband. And when he was telling me about you and a little bit about, the things that you do with the kids and the events that you guys hold, and even the event that he took part in, I think a couple years ago, I instantly was like, I need her on my show. I want to dive into Jeffrey Dahmer because he is one of the very few serial killers that ever said that he truly feels remorse for what he did.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And just kind of knowing some of his background and how he grew up, I'm like, I have to talk to her about this and get her opinion on it. And, I say this almost every show, but for anybody living under a rock who might not know who Jeffrey Dahmer is, he is one of the most infamous serial killers. He drugged his I almost said patients. He drugged his victims. He would kill them. He would cut them up. He would eat them. He would sexually, don't know how to say it properly for the radio. He would
sexually assault them.
Yes.
And then also mutilate them post-mortem, right?
Yes. Yeah. Yes. So there was a lot of different things that he did. And to show remorse for that, there has to be something behind that. So let's dive in because you said you do work with kids and that you were a school counselor. With his childhood, he grew up in a very, very toxic household. His mother was suffering from postpartum depression. His parents did not have the greatest relationship. They were very dysfunctional. And I'm sure he saw that throughout his entire age because he did have a younger brother too that we're not sure which one started the postpartum.
Right.
and his mother would chase her husband around, his father, with a knife. So violence was very well known in his home, and it wasn't anything out of the ordinary. Do you think things like that can kind of desensitize children?
Absolutely. First, let me just make a disclaimer to you and anyone else who's listening. While I consider myself to have expertise in mental health. I've done a lot of work in mental health, and I am a counselor. I also just want to acknowledge that I'm not a expert in serial killers. And so I think it's important just to make that disclaimer, because while I am familiar, I know some of information about Dahmer, I don't know everything. So I just want to make that very clear, and make that statement first, just, for folks. But yeah, absolutely. And even going back and doing research, it looked like he was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, which is a disorder that is often diagnosed in women. It's highly stigmatized. And then he also had some antisocial traits, which makes sense because he didn't necessarily have those attachments. Definitely didn't have attachments to his mom. And so whatever happened, anybody who says, and things can happen later on in life, but however a kid or a person becomes, there's usually some sort of shaping throughout their childhood, whether good or bad. And oftentimes, in my experience with clients, they, don't realize it. And so going back to Dahmer, he may have realized it, he may not have when he was younger, but he definitely had a troublesome childhood in the sense of instability. Mom was an alcoholic, a lot of moving. Yes, mom had postpartum, which, if I remember correctly, he was born in the 60s.
Yes.
So we didn't talk about that stuff then. Postpartum wasn't. They often referred to women as like histrionic, and, labeled them crazy at times because of postpartum. It wasn't a thing. And so also recognizing that his mom, while may have taken some medication, didn't really get help. And then she was in her room a lot, isolated. So he didn't necessarily have that nurturing. And it sounds like dad, once he finished school, was kind of the breadwinner. And I don't know how much he was really around. So he definitely had some attachment issues because he didn't really get to formulate strong relationships. And one other thing, too, is that, and there's more and more research that has come out, and I think a lot more people are talking about it, is things that are hereditary and how things can be passed on, to the child. If a family member has mental health issues, if a parent has mental health issues, the chances of their kid having mental health issues is there. It doesn't guarantee it, but it is there. And so it's definitely, I think, things that impacted him as a child that definitely impacted who he became in becoming a serial killer.
Yeah, and you're 100% right, because his family was very dysfunctional. His mom was suffering with that mental illness, and it might have stemmed a little bit farther than just postpartum depression. We're not sure what other things she could have been diagnosed with, because, like you said, back then they just didn't test for that. And he did have a lot of neglect growing up. When he turned 18, his parents got divorced. His mom took his little brother and left, just left him, because at 18 in the 70s, you're an adult, but they just assumed you're 18, go. But then his dad also left the house and stayed in a motel.
Yeah.
So at 18 years old, he's completely by himself. And that's when he developed a drinking problem. And he started drinking very heavily. He tried to join the military, but he was kicked out due to his drinking. And it was kind of around that time that he committed his first murder. And some of the things that I want to put out there, I am not justifying what Jeffrey Dahmer did by any means.
Of course. But it's a reason, it's kind of the background to help explain how someone could end up this way.
Yes, because he was also a very intelligent person. I mean, he had an IQ of 100, but he was failing his classes.
Mhm.
He was homosexual,
Mhm.
but nobody knew. He had to hide it because, again, this
Mhm.
is the 60s, 70s,
Yep.
80s. It was not acceptable in the world.
Mhm.
And, and then he had this incapable he was just incapable of forming these, emotional relationships because his mother
Mhm.
and his father had left. And there's
Mhm.
just so many different things that play into it.
Mhm.
And I think he developed abandonment issues.
Mhm.
And if we look at his murders and his killings, a lot of them started out with wanting to leave him. It
Mhm.
was he opened up and that person was, what do you
Mhm.
mean you're gay? And they're getting ready to leave, or they're trying to
Mhm.
leave him. And I think that there was also slightly a form of fear that
Mhm.
maybe he didn't understand he had, or he just didn't understand the depth of the fear.
Mhm.
And again, not justifying that, but I do think
Mhm.
that was one of the driving factors for him to commit some of these murders.
Mhm. Yeah. So, it cut out a little bit. His IQ was 100 and what again? I forgot.
145.
45. That's what it was.
Mhm.
Yeah. So interestingly, I think another piece is that TV shows. So I was obsessed with Criminal Minds, and so let me tell it. I could pick out a serial killer, and but it's so fabricated. There may be some basis of someone that created the whole story, but it's so fabricated. And they often talk about serial killers as being organized and disorganized, but in all actuality, there's no really high or necessarily really low intelligence when it comes to folks who are serial killers. But and it is not to say that um, someone who has a very high IQ will be, but yes, there is, this it is connected in some ways with Dahmer specifically, because he was also aware. I think the other thing is like people think, oh, serial killers are crazy. But the definition of like crazy or insanity is that they don't understand what they did was wrong.
Mhm.
Serial killers know what they're doing.
Yeah.
They know that it's wrong. So they do have, an average IQ. And so I think that you're right. That's another piece of thinking about what are their IQs. And he was extremely intelligent. And then again, having so much time probably by himself. Of course, one of the things people always talk about is animals.
Mhm.
They always start with animals. And he had this like obsession with his dad getting bones.
Yeah.
And,
Mhm.
so part of that intelligence being by himself, who knows, mentally and emotionally where his mind went
Right.
when he was younger. And, curiosity and just learning things at a faster pace or just understanding things differently for him, could have enhanced some of those thoughts and feelings, especially if he knew he could get away with it.
Yes.
Right.
Well,
And that's a lot with serial killers too. I feel like they sometimes have a higher IQ or have above average IQ, so they think that they can get away with it, or
Mm-hmm.
they're going to get away with it longer, than the next person.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I sometimes wonder, and this is probably going to make me sound crazy, but you always hear people joke around how everybody has these intrusive thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
We all have that. I wonder what would happen if I just ran my car into the
Mm-hmm.
ditch, or what if I hit that incoming car, or like, I wonder what it would feel like if I,
Mm-hmm.
And it's just weird, intrusive thoughts that people have. I think it's just human nature, but I
Mm-hmm.
do think that there's a sense of like, we know, well, I can't cut my finger off. That's stupid. That's ridiculous. It would hurt. It would bleed. It wouldn't come back.
Mm-hmm.
And I do wonder if that level of intelligence, there's times where people say it's almost like a savant, where they're extremely intelligent in one part and not so much in the other. And I wonder if that intelligence somehow kind of disconnects logical thinking of,
Mm-hmm.
you know, I have these controlling thoughts, I have these invasive thoughts, I'm going to act on them. And then the remorse sets in, like, oh my gosh,
Right.
I shouldn't have done that. Like, is
Mhm.
there a wire that's maybe not
Yeah.
connected? You know,
Yeah.
and it's things like that that I wonder, especially with somebody like Dahmer.
Well, it's interesting. One of the things that has been talked about a lot in the counseling world is neurodiversity. And lately, you know, in the last few years, it's come up more and more. And what being gifted means and how people's, you know, brains work and how that impacts them. And, you know, it's funny, I think about children who are diagnosed with autism, and you know there's different behaviors, but and a lot of times there are children with autism who are super super smart in like a specific subject, and maybe they're not, it's not even that they're not as smart, a lot of times they're just not interested, and when they're not interested it's hard to get them to really um, devote to it. And plus with that black and white thinking, so they're more logical. But yeah, you know, there are so many gifted people out there um, that, you know, do have this way of thinking or this higher level of thinking, and potentially Dahmer had that, but because of his um, development, mental and emotional development as a child, it definitely um, kind of like it could counteract it, I guess, if that makes sense. That's
Yeah.
how I see it. It's like you can be as smart as you want, but if there's no mental and emotional intelligence there, that's another issue.
Yes. And for him being so intelligent, you know, I did listen to a lot of the interview tapes, and I've watched the documentaries and
Mhm.
all those things. And I love listening to his interview tapes because you can tell that he's extremely intelligent,
Mhm.
but he does have almost the emotional development of a child.
Mhm. Mhm.
He does come across very standoffish, kind
Mhm.
of shy.
Mhm.
He talks very low,
Mhm.
and he one of the things he talks about is how controlling his parents were.
Mhm.
And I wonder, you know, again, the environment, like the
Mhm.
violence, the mental illness, the
Mhm.
controlling parents. Because one of the
Mhm.
things I see in his killings is it was almost like he liked to have control over them after he drugged them, you know, with the pictures that were found and things
Mhm.
like that. And it just baffles me because he was so intelligent, but he
Mhm.
does remind me so much of a child.
Mhm.
And I guess in your professional experience, do you think that if Dahmer would have had the resources that we have today, you know,
Mhm.
in school or on his own,
Mhm.
do you think that he could have maybe taken a different route and kind of avoided the killings and maybe
Mhm.
found out how to handle those urges?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely possible. Again, not being an expert in that per se, but I do know that childhood and development does have a large impact on it. So, if he was nurtured in a different way and had good relationships, was able to have a healthy attachment, then yes, that definitely would have um, maybe had him think about things differently, or maybe not have those urges. But it's interesting you talk about him being a child, because when we think about trauma in children, and a lot of times, you know, we think about abuse, whether it's physical, sexual, mental, and emotional. It's been said, and I have read it before years ago, um, when a child is abused, they kind of stop developing mentally and emotionally at whatever age. So if a kid was abused at 8, whatever they're doing at 8, whatever the development level is of an 8-year-old, that kind of, it stifles them. They're kind of stuck there. Now, if they work through that through counseling and they get support and help, you know, there's ways to definitely move forward on that. But I have seen it a lot in kids, and actually a family member of mine who is very, very childlike, who, and as an adult in their 20s, people make comments like, why do I feel like I'm talking to a little kid? A lot less mature mentally and emotionally. And I think that could be part of it, is because he never really, even though he was really, really smart, he never got past whatever age it was that, was when he really started feeling that trauma. And he probably had some complex trauma because it was ongoing trauma. It wasn't just one incident and then it was done. It was consistent traumatic events essentially that happened to him over, several years' time.
Yeah. And that's so interesting. I've never heard it put that way, but I do wonder if that's almost kind of our brain's way of coping. Sorry, I'm going to try to get out of this light so you guys don't have to stare at it. I wonder if that is kind of a way that our brain uses it as a coping mechanism, as, you, for lack of a better term, lost your innocence at this age. And now you need to experience it. And unfortunately, some people just don't grow out of that. And, with Jeffrey Dahmer, one of the things that I know he said that he did struggle with a lot with his urges was being gay. And I don't know how many people know, but in New York in that time, there was kind of like an underground gay club. And he would go to this club and he would live out his fantasies, and he would meet these men, and being able to be who he was and truly show his self, he was able to control the urges. And he mentioned in an interview that it was, it was the 70s, 80s. There was a lot of drugs, alcohol, things like that. And I believe someone had overdosed. I might be wrong. Don't quote me on it, but I believe someone had overdosed in the club and died, and it got shut down. And it was after that club shut down that he felt like he had to hide himself again. And that's when the urges became stronger. And again, I always say I feel bad for him. And I know there's people out there that are just cursing me for it. But I do also think, like, if he was able to be his true self in today's world, those urges might not have been as strong. And I wonder how many other children, with children with anger and children that lash out, like, are those urges just because they don't feel like they can be their true selves?
There's a really good question in the chat. I saw that. I've been waiting, but it says, do you think they start to do bigger things after they don't get caught in their earlier crimes to test themselves more in an intellectual way?
I mean, yeah. I mean, that's why a lot of folks say that they start with animals. And sometimes they may start with more petty crimes. And then they build on it. They grow as maybe their confidence grows.
Right.
That definitely could be something that happens. And yeah, I mean, I think whether it's serial killers or anybody, if a person who is not able to be themselves has to live a fake life all the time, it's going to impact them mentally and emotionally. I mean, we see it every day. I see it so much in my work with kids now. Everybody's wearing this mask. But yeah, especially back then, you couldn't come out as being gay or lesbian. I mean, being gay or lesbian was, the DSM is the book that we use in the counseling psychology world it's kind of like our manual for diagnoses of like mental health and different illnesses. And, it used to be a mental illness in the DSM.
Wow.
And so imagine being gay or lesbian back then, and you were told you had a mental illness. And we didn't do, we had so many of those, what's the word I'm looking for? Those camps that they would send kids to make them stop being gay or lesbian. Why am I drawing a blank on this word?
All I can think of, the only two things was military and Auschwitz, and neither one of those are correct.
Yeah, it's going to come to me. My brain is like fried this late. But yeah, those are the types of things that could have happened, because I don't know what his parents thought. Right. He could have been sent to something like that. And being in parts of rural Ohio, I mean, I'm from Ohio.
Yeah.
And that's just
Right.
not something that you can talk about.
No, and
No.
people are mean, and I know that he even tried to go the religious route. He did move to Wisconsin. He lived
Mhm.
with his grandmother, who was very involved in the church, and
Mhm.
he tried very hard. He went to church. He was talking to the pastor or the priest, and he tried to just indulge himself in religion, and even that didn't work.
Mhm.
And you know, it makes me sad because it makes me think about kids in today's world. And, you know,
Yeah.
there are some parents that are so accepting and,
Mhm.
you know, I'm grateful for that. But there are some parents that even today,
Mhm.
Are
they,
not as accepting.
yeah,
Mhm.
they're not as accepting.
Absolutely.
They make comments that maybe
Mhm.
they don't realize their kids hear everything,
Mhm.
you know, and it's what they wear. And kids
Mhm.
today have it so hard. The media, I mean,
Mhm.
gosh, when I was 14, I was, you know, wearing Lisa Frank stuff. The 14-year-olds, well, you guys, well, Kayla, you're young, but, you know, we're roughly the same age. We know, like, we weren't dressing like 14-year-olds now.
I didn't either. I might
Well,
be
I'm
young,
not, but you're younger than we are.
I know.
No,
You're
you're right.
younger.
I mean, it's funny, and this is kind of off topic, but yeah, when you talk about that, I was watching a show on Netflix earlier with my two cousins, and they were in like detention, and they had collected all their phones, so they were writing. This gay couple was writing back and forth like on a piece of paper, and the guy was like, "Will you be my boyfriend? Yes or no?" And my little cousin, who's like 14, was like, yeah, you could just sit and write like that. You could just sit next to somebody and write notes back and forth. I was like, that's what we did.
And that little thing, do you remember the little toot toot toot
Yes.
toot toot
Yes.
thing we would make?
Heck
Yes.
Yes. So yeah, it is so different now, with social media and approval. And yeah, I mean, thinking about all the things that are coming from COVID
Yes.
and the trauma that kids dealt with if they were in an abusive home, if a kid wasn't in a home where they were supported and being in the LGBTQIA plus house. Sometimes school was that safe haven. Other times it may not have been, but yeah, I mean, imagine what it's like to have to pretend
Mhm.
that you're straight all the time.
Well, and there's that, and you know, then you add cyberbullying onto it because,
Mhm.
you know, with Dahmer, he wasn't bullied, but he wasn't necessarily popular in school.
Right.
But you know, in our age group, if we were getting picked on or we were bullied, we went home and it ended. But
Mhm.
now kids, they don't get that safe haven at home, even if
Right.
they do have a safe home, because
Yeah.
there's the computers and the cell phones
Mhm.
and the
Mhm.
social medias
Yeah.
and they just have so much on their shoulders
Mhm.
that it really does make me worry about the younger generations. I mean,
Oh
I
yeah.
have a 6-year-old and
Mhm.
I'm like, you better not be a bully. But if there is a
Mhm.
bully, you beat them up. Like it's
Mhm.
just
Mhm.
there's so many things we didn't have to worry about as children. And
Yeah.
and it's crazy. And
Mhm.
and I think also school counselors are underutilized.
Absolutely.
100%. I think a
Extremely.
lot of
Abs-
people just assume, oh, I need help with my class. I need to
Mhm.
rearrange my classes. No, that
Mm-mm.
needs to be the person
Mhm.
that you go, your best friend, again, your safe haven,
Right.
you know? And I think it's
Yeah.
so underutilized.
Absolutely. As a former school counselor who had a caseload of 300 kids in a very high need, underserved school, absolutely. I dealt with more mental health probably than anything else. I did do the paperwork stuff, but I had a good relationship with my principals. But thinking back to that time, we were still called guidance counselors, which I hate. FYI, that's like
Right.
the F word to me when people say it. When I'm teaching my students, I'm like, y'all better not say it. I don't care what schools you're in. Your schools might say it, but you don't say it here. But yeah, he probably didn't have a school counselor. And again, thinking about where he was potentially in small town, or even if it wasn't a small town in Wisconsin or Ohio, and trying to be who he is, the school counselors weren't trained that way, for one, and two, there's still so much stigma. It might not even been safe for him to do so.
Right. And
Yes.
you got to think, who would he, even feel comfortable going to talk to? I mean, he
Exactly.
has those clear relationship issues at home. His mom, his dad. We don't even really know if he had a good relationship with his brother even. So there was really no safe place probably for him to talk about that stuff, let alone the stigma about it in the 60s and the 70s.
Yeah.
I mean, there was no one for him to even turn to. So he internalized every single thing and every emotion.
Yeah.
Well, and he was alone a lot. I mean, he would go home and his mom had ran off with his younger brother. His dad was a motel. So, this kid, I mean, I don't care. At 18, you're still a kid.
Yeah.
You go home, you have to cook for yourself. You have to clean for yourself, do your laundry. And then you're hiding your true identity. You're struggling with these thoughts. It's a weight that I don't think anybody should have to deal with. And I do think that if he had the outlets that we have today, maybe it wouldn't have made a difference, but maybe it would have, because I don't think he received any type of valuation until he was already in prison and the crimes are already done. So there's no turning back.
Well, you got to think too, is like before he started committing these crimes, you had already mentioned that he went to the military, right? And then he got kicked out because of alcohol, so he was already struggling with the mental health issues. And then a lot of times, an outlet to that could be drinking, drugs, all that stuff. So maybe he was trying to join the military to, better himself in that way. And then again, with the church and everything, like it just, mental health help was not available. And I mean, even in today's society, like it's much better than it was. But even today's society, like some people still have a huge stigma on mental health. And like it's incredible to see some of these like celebrities talking about it, because people can relate to that. People look up to these people and it helps. You don't feel so alone. So like if that was something then, it could have been different.
And then another thing he had against him too is, for some reason, women's mental health is taken more seriously than men.
All the time.
Men cry or upset or something, they're supposed to, boys don't cry, men don't do this. You put on your big pants and you be the breadwinner. Like the men just don't get the same leniency as women do. And that's another thing he had, and he had said in several interviews that he knew that these thoughts and these urges were bad. And that's why he started drinking, is he was trying to suppress them along with everything else he had going for him. And it just, unfortunately he couldn't suppress it much longer. And then he did what he did.
And we're not defending what he did by any means.
No, that's why I said I am not condoning what he did. But the reason I wanted to do tonight's show is because I wanted people to understand how important mental health is for people who consider themselves normal, people who are having intrusive thoughts, people who are having issues at home. I want them to know that there are outlets that they can go to. And I'm going to say this and people are probably going to be angry, but I do believe that everybody has a slight form of mental illness, whether it is a coping mechanism from a trauma that you've had, whether it's, as Brian likes to say, planning for doomsday, or you always think bad things are going to happen, or you're scared of the dark, or there's a wide range. Mental illness just doesn't mean you're crazy. It means there's so many different spectrums of it.
I was going to say it's a very broad spectrum of that.
And it's not black and white. It's very gray. No. Yeah, absolutely. Conversion camps. I was in my brain and I was like, why can't I think about it? But yeah, and it's interesting listening to you both, because we're talking about the lack of mental health resources and whatnot, and how it wasn't talked about back then. And yet now it seems people probably perceive it as, I've been asked a lot of times, like, what happened? Why are people all struggling? And I'm like, is it that they are struggling more? Or is it that it was happening before, we just didn't talk about it? And so now we have this shortage of resources because we don't have enough counselors. between insurance and accessibility, there's so many things there, right? We're still fighting as school counselors to be recognized as mental health professionals. So I think that there, especially with COVID, when you said people have a slight mental health, COVID impacted everybody,
Yes.
whether they want to necessarily, I mean, some of it you may have had some good moments too. Some people talk about they were able to focus more on family and kind of relax. And there were some good things, but overall, between the media talking about all the people who died, the videos of seeing people in frozen semis, and now on top of the violence, against
Yes.
Black people that you see, anytime something happens, they're showing it. George Floyd. And just the anxiety of am I going to get sick?
Right.
Wearing a mask, not wearing a mask. I mean, there's so many things that impact people. And it doesn't mean that, you're crazy or whatever, but everybody experiences anxiety sometimes. Everybody has mood issues sometimes, depending on their resilience and their support system will depend on how severe those issues get. But everybody experiences those things at times. And I think so many people are in denial about it that it is still stigmatized. And even though we're talking about it more, there's still those people that are like, oh, you're crazy.
Oh,
Right.
yeah.
Right. And I think that I think you're 100% right that what we have gone through in the last couple of years, even 9/11 and COVID and the school shootings, and it all leaves an impact on us, whether we want to admit it or not. I mean, and something as simple as getting on a plane. And I've said it before, if you get on a plane and you see somebody with a turban, that's going to automatically put your anxiety into effect. And it's not that you think anything of this person. You might not, show any racism toward this person, but because the media and because what we see and what's been put in our face over and over and over, your anxiety is going to be high. And for anybody who is going to deny this, if you're in the store and someone starts coughing, what's your first thought?
Oh, during COVID?
I mean,
now,
even now,
when they start coughing?
Even now, if I hear somebody hacking up a lung, I'm like, ooh, maybe
Get
I should
away
put a
from
mask
me.
on. Yes. And I used to be like, oh, they probably have a cold. And now I'm like, ooh, like they probably got COVID. And it's not fun. I mean, people say it in a joking manner. It's even though it's not funny, but it does. Big events like that kind of almost train us, and that right there, I feel falls into mental illness because now we think differently. And like I said, if somebody's coughing up a lung, my first thing is, oh, I should probably put a mask on, or oh, cover your mouth. And it's that anxiety that you don't realize you have, and a fear.
Yeah. Well, I now, if I'm sick or if I cough, I'm always like, it's not COVID.
Yes. I do that too. If I sneeze,
because
I'm like,
I don't want other people to. I also know other people get anxious.
Yes.
And so I think there's a part of me that's like, oh, let me make this comment so people don't freak out about it, because I understand, that anxiety that can come with it.
Yeah. Well, and then also I think people need to realize that everybody experiences trauma in their life. And I don't care if you're the strongest person out there, trauma causes some type of issues. When I was younger, I went through trauma, and I know that because of that trauma, there are certain things I do now and certain things that scare me and certain things that freak me out that I don't think would be there if it wouldn't have happened. And that can fall under mental health, and going back to counselors being underutilized, I think you guys have a bad stigma. I think people assume, oh, you're going to a counselor, what's wrong with you?
Right.
But I will be the first person to say, I love my counselor. I go see a therapist, not that anything's wrong, but sometimes you need that outside person. You just want their advice because yes, you can talk to your spouse or your parents or your sisters, brothers, whatever, but everyone has this already preconceived notion of the event you're describing. Your therapist or your counselor does not. So they have no merit in the game. They have no bias, and they're going to tell you how it is. And sometimes they tell you things you don't want to hear. And that's why I think having a therapist is incredible, and everybody should have one.
Yeah. And there's such a misconception. I mean, that's one of the things I want to do too. And I've talked to Brian about this, is educate the community, where we grew up. I know he hates going back there, but I still have a lot of family here. And so it's nice at times to come home, but there's still that stigma and such a lack of resources. But it's even just the idea of like the term therapist, like that's kind of like a over an umbrella term, but within that you have licensed mental health counselors, licensed social workers, psychologists, and psychiatrists, which are the doctors who prescribe meds. So it's also this misconception of like, oh, well, I don't want to go see a psychiatrist. They're going to put me on medication. They're not going to do counseling. Well, that's because that's what a psychiatrist goes to school for. They are a medical doctor, and they go, they do their residency through psychiatry, but they go through medical school. Whereas me, I'm licensed, but I don't give medication. I do talk therapy. And so it's this idea of like, what are you going to? Does it mean you have to get on medication? That shouldn't be, in my opinion, unless it's a severe case or chronic. The first thing shouldn't necessarily be medication. And medication and talk therapy go hand in hand. If you've had a trauma and you're depressed, taking a Zoloft isn't going to make it go away. You have to work through it. And I think that's another piece of, how many of these folks have experienced something and haven't received the help. And the trauma definition, it's a long definition, but basically trauma is experienced or perceived imminent danger. And so I may have been in a car and saw a really, really bad car accident and almost got hit. I didn't get hit, but I saw it. Maybe somebody died. Like I might have been safe, but that's a trauma because I had a perceived sense of danger. People going to the dentist can be traumatizing. Getting bitten by a dog, trauma isn't just abuse or murder. Trauma can be other things as well. But we don't really acknowledge that.
No, and I am so glad that you said that because, and Kayla's going to laugh when I say this, but there are people out there who their trauma is losing a loved one. There are people who watch loved ones suffer with different diseases, cancers, things like that, and they die. And that is a trauma because now you don't have that person in your life. The car accidents can be trauma. Losing a family dog can be a trauma. And I think that's why I say that everybody has experienced a trauma. And I hate that people say, well, my trauma is worse. What's the definition of worse? I cannot stand that. And this is completely off topic, but it's like, how is somebody's trauma worse than another trauma? You didn't experience that. Okay. So, you broke your toes and I broke my finger. I don't know what your pain level was. You don't know what mine is. It's still trauma, and it's how that person experienced it. And going back to the therapist and some people with the prescribing of medications, I know mine personally, the first thing she said is, do you feel depressed? And I said, no. And she looked at me, she goes, look, if you're here for medication, we're not going that route. She goes, we're going to talk through it. We're going to see why you're here. If I feel you need medication, we'll talk about it, but that's not the first outlet. And I looked at her and I'm like, thank you. Because my fear, it took me years to go, and Brian can back me up on this. It took me years because I'm like, I do not want to be put on medication for anything because I know what my issues are. And it's just kind of dealing with, family things and stuff like that. But I'm like, medication can't help me. And she was right. And that's why I love her, is because she looked at me, she's like, no, you don't, I'm not prescribing you medication. That's the easy way out.
Yeah. That's why we do assessments, not all assessments are created equal, but that's why we do assessments to see, is someone mild, moderate, or severe, and how long. We look at the frequency, we look at the duration, is someone so depressed that they're not showering? Has this been going on for a day or months? All of those things make a difference. And it's when you talk about, we call it trauma Olympics in the counseling world at times. And I often say it's due to our society, because if you notice, certain people put things on Facebook and it's like, oh, think positive, at least you have your kids, or at least you have someone who loves you. It's always those things. And I think people, for the most part, you do have those who do victimize, who enjoy kind of being the victim. And I hate to say
Right.
that like that, because I don't think they enjoy it, but there's like this feeling
Attention.
of seeing people care. Maybe you feel like they don't
They
care in
enjoy
other
the
parts of their
attention
life.
of it.
Yes.
But for the most part, I know that my grandma dying last week from dementia sucked. Seeing it sucked. It is kind of traumatizing. I am a little traumatized. But I also know that I didn't lose my child to Dr. Error like some people
Right.
have. And I'm not saying that mine is worse or theirs is worse, but mine is mine and theirs is
Yours
theirs.
is yours.
Yes.
And we always tell people to like get over it, or at least you have this, at least you have that. And it's like, yeah, in the grand scheme of things, I know this. But in this moment right now, let me feel it. I feel like shit, and let me feel like shit. I'm upset, and let me be upset.
And
stop trying to tell me to just think positive.
Yes.
Right.
That doesn't work.
And sometimes all you want is someone to be like, I get it. I'm sorry. And, one of the things I hate the most is when somebody goes, oh, I understand what you're going through. And I want to be like, do you though? Or have you gone through this? Have it? And now, if they
Right.
have, great.
Right.
But, if I'm upset or I'm trying to, explain my feelings, I understand. Oh, but at least this, at least that. I want someone just like, that sucks.
Yep.
And I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm.
And
is there
almost
anything I can do to help?
Yeah,
If you
it's just
need someone to talk
validating
to.
that your feelings are real and it's okay to feel that way. That's it.
Right. And I can imagine back when Dahmer, was having his struggles. Again, I don't know everything, but mom with depression, alcoholism. I don't know if there's any other sort of abuse in his life, but some people might have been like, well, at least you had parents. You know what I mean? So it's also this idea of like, we minimize each other a lot, and would he have been minimized, based off of what he was going through, because maybe he was seen to have two parents, or his dad had a job or whatever. And so, yeah, it goes back to how in society, it's always that pick yourself up by the bootstraps. That happened a lot. I think that comes from the boomers, and we're making those changes now, but it's still ingrained in us as a society in the system.
Yes, 100%. And, and one of the things that, again, why I love Dahmer is, well, I don't love him, but you guys know that came out way different.
It is okay.
Story
yeah, he is the epitome of, a toxic environment, because I don't want to put all the blame on his parents. I mean, there are some people that have some really awful childhoods, and they make great lives for themselves. And that's great. But with everything he had against him, I don't want to put all the blame on his parents. He did do these things. Nobody told him to do them. But, he is the epitome of why it's so important to take care of yourself mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually, all of that. So, for anybody who might feel like they need help or want to reach out, what are some good avenues that you've heard of or that you know of that they could, reach out, and even if it's just as a referral?
Yeah. One thing within the last couple of years, and I think it was from that COVID stimulus, a lot, and I know people struggle with like community mental health agencies because they usually are overworked and underpaid. But there's been funding invested into community mental health agencies, which typically, will work with you financially. A lot of therapists will do like sliding scales. There's still issues with insurances, but like I know Blue Cross Blue Shield, I think United, they don't necessarily put a limit on it. You know, you just have your copay. But there are also insurances who are like, oh, you only get this many sessions. And that's also an issue. I actually don't take insurance right now because insurance is you have to diagnose on the first session because they have to have a diagnosis to be covered.
Right.
And you have to write your notes basically showing that there's still a continuing issue. So if I have a client who's having a good day and we have a great session, then that's going to be like, oh, well, they're doing fine.
They don't need this anymore. They're good.
Right. And so we can't lie or, anything like that. But we do have to say, oh, they could still be struggling with this or whatever. And so it's difficult to do those things. Also, people like police officers, certain service folks, and doctors, there's a stigma for them to reach out. So I would also encourage them if they don't want to reach out to like their employee benefits or their work benefits. If you can afford it, I'm about private pay or sliding scale so that you don't necessarily have to deal with that stigma. There's also so many more counselors that are doing telehealth, and research says that there's been research, and I've also done just anecdotal research with my clients. Like they feel just fine. They don't feel any less connected to me, any less like counseling's not helping them. And it helps people who maybe don't want to be seen going into a counselor's office, or in a town like Fremont that has minimal resources. I've looked for counselors for family members and found them in Columbus and Toledo, and they do telemental health. So they were able to find somebody who, they felt comfortable with. So there are definitely a lot of, there are resources, but there's also a lot of barriers. So you have to kind of you have to look for things. You have to be savvy at times, but also going to a place like and asking for help, going to a community mental health center and saying this, do you have any recommendations? Your doctor can have referrals. And there's a lot of like different, rich and famous people doing things, especially in the, being Black myself and biracial, but identifying as Black. There's a lot of things out there now for therapy for Black girls and different things that folks are doing to help, communities of color as well, because they are less likely to go and stay in therapy. So.
Right. Yes. Yeah. And unfortunately, it is coming time to end the show. But I do want to tell everybody, if you feel that you need to reach out, please do, because with everything that we go through in today's world and work and kids and family, and it's a stressful life, and, reach out, keep yourself healthy, again, mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually, all of it, whatever it takes. Even if you just want to reach out to me and Kayla and Adrianne, her socials are in the beginning of the chat. You can reach out to her for professional help and guidance. Kayla and I are always willing to lend an ear and help any way we can. But with that, you guys, thank you so much for being on the show. I love having you guys on here, and it was a great topic to talk about tonight. For everyone watching, I will not be on next week. I'm on vacation, so you'll catch me in 2 weeks. Not sure of a topic yet, but we'll come up with one. But with that, everyone have a great night, and thank you so much for being on. I appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting me. This was amazing. I love mental health, so it's my jam.
Absolutely. So everyone have a great night.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
The truth is here and now on WLTK-db Talk Radio at WLTK-db.com.